So, I wish you all a good morning, this 30th of April. We're all very excited. We're trying to set up the first webinar series from the ABS initiative in Corona times. My name is Peter Schauerte. I'm part of GeoMedia, supporting the ABS initiative in its implementation efforts. And we are very happy to have you all with us. I see more and more people joining in. I'm already seeing a very good discipline concerning muted microphones and turned off cameras. Thank you very much for that. And I would propose that we start with just a few opening remarks from the coordinator of the ABS initiative, Dr. Hartmut Meyer, who's with us and who I invite now to take the floor.
Thank you. Good morning. This is Hartmut speaking. I'd like to welcome you all to this seminar, also in the name of Dr. Ouedraogo from the African Union Commission. This webinar is our first event in a whole series of webinars on various ABS issues. It's a capacity development activity the ABS initiative is undertaking now in cooperation with the African Union Department of Human Resources and Science and Technology, one of our good and long-time partners in Africa. We set up these webinars for African ABS focal points and experts because when all these lockdowns due to the SARS virus came, we felt that it was very, very necessary to continue our discussions and also our trainings and to support the African ABS experts in preparing to the coming negotiations on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We all know that the international calendar now has been really shaken up. Everything is postponed. But actually, we know that all these discussions on ABS, on DSI and capacity development will come, and we should not enter that unprepared. So, for us also, this is the first time that the ABS initiative runs such a webinar. We are all very excited, and we hope that it runs well and that you have a very good participation and that you take good learning messages back home. Yeah, with that, I'd like to open this session and give the mic to Peter again.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, Eva. So this is, as Hartmut said, the first webinar in that series, Introduction and Overall Options to Implement ABS. And we thought it would be a good idea to slowly get started. So we called this one Introduction to the Webinar Series. Next slide, please. And I would like to start with a couple of remarks concerning reporting. As Hartmut said, it's the first time for all of us, and we are also trying to go some new paths concerning reporting. For this, we are currently trying to record this webinar to ensure you, and in order to respect data protection issues, we are planning to then cut out all discussion parts and only show for download in a video file the presentations with the respective voices of the presenters. So those will be made publicly available for download, but the discussions, so your voices, will not be made publicly available. In order to capture what we will be discussing, we will elaborate an anonymized written report that shall then summarize those discussions and which we will then send around to the participants. In order to do that, so that we can be able to send you the report, we invite you to simply type your email address in the chat function of MS Teams. And so as soon as you have typed your email address into the chat, it is guaranteed that you will then also receive the report of the webinar, because we did not go through a registration process. Everybody can take part. So we need to have a way of recording your email address. I'm just in the first email address. Very good. That's the way to do it. And then you will receive the report. Next slide, please. There's some rules. Unfortunately, we can't go without rules. So the first one is already working very well. Microphones are muted and cameras are turned off. We try to do that to have some good connections and to not overload the available connections, and also not to have too many background noises of playing kids or barking dogs, as we all know already with our increasing experience of webinars and Zoom and Skype conferences. So the oral inputs of you, so your questions and comments, we invite you to only do those after the presentations. We basically have 2 presentations foreseen, and after each presentation we will have 15 minutes of discussion. And so if you want to ask a question or have a comment in these 15 minutes after the presentation, we would again ask you to type either your name or just a quick word on, comment or question into the chat function again. You see on the right-hand side the little icon, the third icon from above that indicates the chat. So if you want to write something, click on this icon in your MS Teams surface right now, and you will be able to type in. And then during the discussion, if the moderator, which I am for now, if I would say your name and call your name, then you are invited to unmute your mic and then ask your question as precise as possible or give your comment. Next slide, please. In order to keep this going, we invite you to, or we ask you to not push any other buttons than the 3 we have already been talking about. So the chat function, and if you want to put your name in the list or type a question, the mic button if you are being given the floor during the discussion, so then you unmute your mic. And once you have finished your question comment, then please mute your mic again so we can continue in a good quality. If you happen to have a toolbar right now in covering part of your presentation, an MS Teams toolbar, you can click once with your cursor on the presentation and then do not move the cursor anymore. And then the toolbar will disappear for you to have a better view on the slides. Next slide, please. So the background, Hartmut already said, it's due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Several national and regional activities had to be postponed. We still don't know when we can pick up again, and we wanted to keep things going. So that's why we identified together with the African Union Commission 4 clusters of remote support. The first one is mapping and fostering the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol in Africa. That is the one that this webinar series is located within. The second cluster is knowledge generation on mutually agreed terms, MAT, and benefit sharing. So that's about contracts a lot. The third cluster is about contribution of ABS to conservation and sustainable use. And the fourth one is outreach and capacity development on the hot topic right now, which is digital sequence information in Africa. So right now we are just introducing a first series within the first cluster, mapping and fostering the implementation. And we are also looking forward to your inputs in order to properly come up and design with webinar activities on the other clusters. So we would like to understand also what kind of frequency you prefer to have for the upcoming webinars and what kind of topics to be to be treated with. So if you have any urgent issues on this or any ideas, please do not hesitate to type them into the chat function. All of this will be recorded. Next slide, please. Within this series, we have foreseen 4 webinars. The first one, that's what we're in right now, Introduction and Overall Options to Implement ABS. So we just get a quick introduction to the AU guidelines and overall introduction, and then an introduction to the ABS initiatives publication, ABS implementation options, and then discuss the way forward. The second webinar is called How to Get Started. There we will talk about how to set up a multi-stakeholder process for elaborating a new ABS system or for updating an existing one, how to use the AU guidelines and the implementation options. We will discuss the role of visualizations and flowcharts of ABS procedures and how to elaborate them, how to work on them, and how to translate those visualizations into legal texts. Third webinar is on the choice of suitable legal instruments. So once you have decided on what kind of system, ABS system you are aiming for, you have to choose how to translate that into legal instruments and which are the legal instruments that are best suited to do so. So there we will, present the diversity of legal instruments that exists and discuss how to identify the suitable legal instruments. And the fourth one is about technical issues that could be a very large one. Maybe this is going to be several ones depending on the needs that will be communicated to us. There we would like to discuss specific technical issues that are to be tackled when designing an ABS system. And there we have a long list. You can see that in the concept note that has been sent along. It's about DSI institutional and coordination related issues. It's about permitting systems, online permitting systems, about the scope, the interface between Nagoya and the FAO Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, compliance, contracts, special considerations, Article 8, additional topics upon request. So that is just to give you a broad overview of how we're planning to do this. And with that, next slide, please. I would just like to have a first question to you guys and maybe use the chat function concerning what your preferred frequency or periodicity for the upcoming webinars would be. So far in the concept note, we wrote that we would like to have them once a week. But this is up to discussion. We have 3 options here: once a week, once every 2 weeks, or once a month. And in order to get an idea of what you would prefer, I already see the first ones are already typing in. Just type in your preferred frequency in the chat, and afterwards we are going to evaluate and look at it and see how to keep on going. Until now, the first 2 wrote every 2 weeks, once every 2 weeks. So please type that in. This is also in order to get used to the functions of the MS Teams and this webinar. Next slide, please, because with this, I would like to pass the floor to our colleague Pierre Duplessis, who elaborated together with Olivier this presentation on the African Union guidelines for the coordinated implementation of the Nagoya Protocol in Africa. And with that, Pierre, please, you have the floor, and then after Pierre's presentation, we will have the first round of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this presentation. I'm going to run through some background very quickly, just so that everyone has an understanding of where the African Union guidelines came from and how they were intended to be used in implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. And then we will pick up, as we continue with this series, we'll pick up more detail on the contents of the framework and compare that with the implementation options that have been exercised and are still available to us. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, who's work? Ah, there you go. Thank you. No, now you've gone too far.
You see the slide, Pierre?
I can see, but it's not the right one. There you go. There we go. Okay, thank you very much. So it's almost 10 years since the Nagoya Protocol was adopted in 2010. It's important to recall that adoption was based on a compromise around the text that the Japanese presidency presented to us basically on the last night of the Nagoya COP. And that we agreed to that despite the fact that some key African negotiating positions were not included in the final text. And the reasons that the ministers who were present in Nagoya agreed to adopt the text, nevertheless, despite these points not being included, is because they understood and they believed that we could use the national flexibilities that were contained in the protocol in a coordinated way to safeguard African interests. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the adoption of the protocol also raised some questions about what would happen to the 2001 OAU Model Law for the protection of the rights of local communities, farmers and breeders, and for the regulation of access to biological resources, which was developed before the Nagoya Protocol and the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. And so we commissioned a study in 2011, 2012 to look at the model law again in light of these new international instruments, bearing in mind, of course, that the model law was only adopted for Africa, whereas the Nagoya Protocol and the International Treaty are international multilateral instruments. And we identified a number of gaps and variances in between the law and the situation at the time. I reported back to the 6th Pan-African ABS workshop, which was held in Limbe, if I remember correctly, where we then got a mandate to lead the development of for the African Union Commission to lead the development of these AU guidelines on the Nagoya Protocol to complement the model law. Next slide, please. There was also at the same time an issue around the coordination of Africa in biodiversity and ABS matters. And in January 2011, partly as a response to the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol, the African Union Assembly included biodiversity in the African Union priorities for the first time. And in September 2012, the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment, the 14th meeting of AMCEN, adopted a decision on the establishment of a coordination mechanism for negotiations on biodiversity, which was based on the coordination mechanism that Africa has been using in climate change negotiations. And I should point out, although there's not a slide on this, that this coordination mechanism was reconfirmed by the AMCEN meeting earlier this year. So then the process, right? So the AMCEN 14, it endorsed the ongoing work on the guidelines. The AU Assembly then extended that mandate by adopting the AMCEN report. We developed a first draft, which we presented to the 7th Pan-African ABS workshop in Palabora in South Africa, and we received extensive stakeholder comments on the first draft. And then in October of that year, we had an expert meeting where we ended up separating the policy framework from the step-by-step guide, and worked on further worked on the policy framework, and then decided that we would have a peer review before we have a full validation. Next slide, please. So we then send that revised policy framework out in December to all focal points and stakeholders. We established a peer review experts group. We received nominations for experts from the regional economic coordination bodies. And in February 2014, we had an experts workshop in Addis Ababa at the African Union Commission, where representatives of all of the stakeholder groups and of course the secretariats of the body of the CBD and the international treaty, and experts from various user groups and experts from indigenous peoples and local communities or participated. Next slide, please. That expert workshop then discussed the first complete draft of the guidelines. And it was comprising of a policy framework, a step-by-step guide, and annexes, and redrafted and restructured the document and made proposals for amendments. Next slide, please. So that was then followed by a validation workshop, which was held in August 2014, where the policy framework was adopted. The policy framework and the guidelines were modified and validated. So experts were saying, right now, we're happy with this. It was then presented in March the following year to the next meeting of AMCEN, which was in Cairo. Next slide, please. And this meeting, AMCEN 15, basically validated at a political level the policy framework, which was then renamed the strategic framework, and the guidelines, the accompanying guidelines, and then tabled that to the 25th ordinary session of the Assembly of the African Union, which is the highest decision-making body in the African Union, which adopted the AMCEN 15 report, including the African Union guidelines. So at that stage, those guidelines then became officially adopted African instruments. Next slide, please. So just, to point out that the guidelines consist of two separate documents. The first one is a policy framework, a strategic framework, which then provides the basis for a more practical, hands-on tool in the form of the guidelines for implementation. So just to be very clear about this, the first one, the framework, is actually an official policy document of the African Union, whereas the guidelines, because it's a practical tool, was not politically endorsed because it leaves a lot of flexibility and it provides more guidance. It's not the sort of document that you would expect political endorsement from policymakers. Next slide, please. Okay, so the general objectives of the guidelines are to provide policy and strategic guidance to support the implementation of Nagoya Protocol in Africa. And to facilitate coordination and cooperation between African countries and African stakeholders around ABS implementation, and to provide practical guidance on how national ABS systems can be implemented in a regionally coordinated manner. Now, the reason these general objectives are particularly important is partly because Africa shares so many resources in Africa are shared between different countries, right? Because of the history of colonialism, the way that the colonial borders were drawn on a map in the Berlin Conference, with no respect for ecosystems or the distribution of ethnic groups, etc. So, in very many cases, African borders cut through ecosystems, and you find the same resources occurring in 2 or 3 or 17 different countries, right? And if we did not have a coordinated approach to implementation, then we would have a situation where users would go to those countries that didn't have ABS systems in place and would then, play off one country against another, and we would be forced as African countries to lower our standards in what was at the time described as a race to the bottom. We would all try and provide access as easily as possible, or we would lower and lower our benefit sharing expectations so as to get investment and research on our resources, which is why cooperation was so important. Next slide, please. So the general objectives also was to encourage utilization, right? Because the idea of ABS is not to stop utilization; it's to ensure that utilization is legitimate and that there's benefits for the providing countries. So it is a clear objective of the guidelines to encourage utilization, to support regional objectives and strategies for human resource development, technology transfer, scientific and technical capacity building, food security, economic growth, and do this while encouraging conservation and sustainable use of natural and human capital, including the rights that indigenous people and local communities have to their resources and their associated traditional knowledge. And then one of the main things that Africa had proposed during the Nagoya negotiations, which we did not get in the end in the final text, was the idea that there need to be ABS standards. And one of the things that we hoped we would develop as a result of these guidelines is to establish common African ABS standards. Next slide, please. So the policy framework contains the objective, which is the policy and strategic guidance. It has the definitions or use of terms section, which is really important because if different countries define the same wording in different ways, then you get a very confusing situation. So consistency in language was considered very important. There was a coordinated approach to procedures and awareness raising and information sharing, which was as a strategic guidance. There's a coordinated approach to access of genetic resources for their utilization, a coordinated approach to benefit sharing, a coordinated approach to monitoring and compliance, and then also, very importantly, a coordinated approach to traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources and with farmers, community and farmers' rights, and economic development and capacity building and technology transfer for sustainable use and conservation. In other words, that very important focus for access and benefit sharing on providing a source of socio-economic development while supporting conservation and sustainable use. Next slide, please. So the guidelines and the annexes, the more practical part of the overall package, it provides, these are step-by-step guidelines providing detailed technical guidance and background considerations for people who are leading the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. So it's primarily aimed at focal points and other stakeholders involved in developing and implementing ABS systems at national and local level. And because of different national circumstances, the coordination approach also still leaves a large degree of national discretion and flexibility. And included in the access were a model application form for a permit to utilize genetic resources or associated traditional knowledge, the outlines of a basic ABS agreement, which we always need to fill out in consultation with experts in contract law, a commentary on the key elements of a complete ABS agreement. So when you use the outline of the basic one, then you would, of course, need to consider the elements that are in this commentary and some basic principles for community involvement in ABS. Just to point out that the work around the application, I mean, specifically around the ABS agreements and how to develop mutually agreed terms, contracts, and so on, has, since the adoption of the guidelines, progressed quite substantially. And as Peter said in his introductory overview of the webinar series, it will form a separate part of this webinar series. There will be a specific look at mutually agreed terms and how to work with them. Next slide, please. So the policy and technical guidance that were provided in these guidelines was to basically there needs to be cooperation to develop compatible continental and regional procedures for granting prior informed consent, concluding mutually agreed terms, and monitoring compliance by users. That there should be transparent and functional access regulations, because if you don't have those access regulations visible to users, then of course they wouldn't know what to comply with. And specifically to also clarify that even though you can have physical access to an African genetic resource, for example, from ex-situ collections or through commodity trade, that this does not constitute legitimate access for utilization as described in the Nagoya Protocol. Next slide, please. It also pointed out the importance of ensuring that the prior informed consent or approval and involvement of IPLCs is obtained where they have established rights to grant access to genetic resources, and they always have the right to grant access or withhold access to their associated traditional knowledge. Again, clarifying for everyone to see that absence of domestic ABS measures does not imply that there's no PIC requirement. And the same thing, when it comes to traditional knowledge, these points are repeated in the strategic guidelines, because there is a misunderstanding, I would say, by some of our negotiating partners that if you don't have national legislation, your resources and your traditional knowledge are available without restriction in a free-for-all. Anyone who gets access to them can use them in any way that they want. Whereas, the guidelines clarify that that's not the case in Africa, and that anyone who does this, will then, be regarded as illegitimate access, having obtained illegitimate access, will be basically guilty of and that African countries will collaborate to ensure that this doesn't happen, and that people who do this will suffer consequences, specifically in the form of being denied future access in other African countries. Next slide, please. So there was also guidance on ensuring that naturally occurring biochemical derivatives are included in national systems. At the time, there was a big disagreement about whether derivatives actually are in the scope or not of the Nagoya Protocol. So in the African understanding of the Nagoya Protocol, they are very much included. There was also guidance to exempt from your ABS regulations the trading commodities that doesn't result in access or utilization. Because of the practical difficulties of trying to control biotrade, for example, trade in biotrade commodities. And then this concept that if there's a change of intent, then that must be notified, and the required ABS procedures for utilization as research and development as defined in the Nagoya Protocol must then be complied with. Now, of course, this must be included in your original mutually agreed terms for it to be effective. But this is the general guidance, is that the change of intent must be included and must be taken into consideration in your contracts. Next slide, please. Also, the further guidance was to encourage customary use and exchange, because those are not affected by the Nagoya Protocol, to encourage mutually supportive implementation of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture and the Nagoya Protocol, and to promote and encourage research that contributes to conservation and sustainable use through simplified access procedures for non-commercial research, and also for the other circumstances described in Article 8 of the Nagoya Protocol. For example, health emergencies, be they human, animal, or plant health emergencies, and also the special nature of genetic resources for food and agriculture and their contribution to sustainable agriculture and food security in Africa. Next slide, please. Right. So there was also guidance to cooperate and coordinate the policies towards establishing transparent, fair, equitable benefit sharing standards that uphold the value of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge, and to encourage the development of sectoral and cross-sectoral model contractual clauses for mutually agreed terms, and codes of conduct, guidelines, and best practices and standards for benefit sharing. Next slide, please. The guidelines also encourage compliance through the use of checkpoints, internationally recognized certificates of compliance, as well as regular and systemic information exchange mechanisms between African provider countries. Further guidance in the guidelines was that countries should only provide genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge for utilization to users that are domiciled within African Union member states or within the jurisdiction of a party to the Nagoya Protocol that has adequate compliance and mutual support measures in place. So don't give access to the Americans, basically. Next slide, please. There was work that was done 5 years ago, right? And I mean, one of the things that came to prominence after the adoption of the guideline is the issue of digital sequence information. They were not explicitly addressed in African Union guidelines, but they are implicitly, DSI is implicitly covered by the strong undertaking in the guidelines, in the policy instrument, that on regional cooperation to safeguard the rights to genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. So implicitly, and I think it is pretty much recognized that when DSI is used to circumvent the rights of granting PIC and benefiting from utilization, then, of course, this African solidarity principle applies just as much to DSI as it applies to material resources. And the current consensus in Africa is that DSI will be included in national PIC and MAT systems, at least until an international maybe multilateral solution is agreed and in place. Now, we will also, as you saw in the introduction, have a separate webinar around the technical issues of DSI, and I don't want to go into this a lot today, and I would ask you to refrain from making this a DSI webinar because that was not the intention. I have one final comment. I think I'm out of time just about now, which is that in my view, the biggest shortcoming so far of implementation of ABS in Africa has been that far too few countries have published their ABS requirements on the ABS clearinghouse. Right? According to the Nagoya Protocol, that is the authoritative place to notify the world that you require PIC and MAT. And if you do not put anything on the clearinghouse, then essentially by the law, as it works in the Nagoya Protocol, you are not exercising your right to control access. So I would, this as a final word in the presentation, again try to emphasize that even if you don't have a national ABS system, at least put up a notice on the clearinghouse that says, we do not grant free access. We are working on a system, and in the meantime, as a member of the African Union, we will stick to the African Union guidelines. But that at least puts users on notice that they cannot just come to your country and take your resources and say, oh, well, there was no ABS system in place. It was free access. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Next slide. Thank you very much, Pierre, for this introduction to the AU guidelines. I think this gave a very good overview, and as I said in the beginning, after each presentation, we will have a certain time for questions and answers. Further delaying, next slide, please, Eva. I would invite Suhel from the ABS initiative to give us the presentation on the publication that has been elaborated against the backdrop of the African Union guidelines, pointing out some more detailed ABS implementation options. Suhel, are you with us, and can you take the floor, please?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for providing me the opportunity. There's so many known faces, although I can't see the faces behind the icons. And yes, my task is here to provide you a little bit of an overview on a presentation, on a publication, a brochure that we have compiled and also presented at the last Pan-African workshop in Cape Town on possible implementation options of the Nagoya Protocol, also in accordance with the guidelines that we just have discussed. Next slide, please. I think it's important to state that what I'm trying to do is to create a little bit of appetite for these implementation options, that because this will be element of the next seminar, to look a little bit deeper into the different options at different levels, how the Nagoya Protocol could be implemented in Africa. As we already heard, the protocol needs to be translated into national ABS regulatory frameworks. We had a bit of discussions on that. And this, of course, in Africa, against the backdrop of the AU guidelines, which were adopted by AMCEN and the heads of states, as we know. We know that countries are coming from very different backgrounds, very different legal systems. There are, of course, common law systems, there are civil law systems, and with different constitutional setups. So there's really no one size fits all. And in implementation, there are different levels of rights in the African countries. And there are, of course, different goals and visions by decision makers, how ABS could serve as a tool for biodiversity conservation or also for local development. And so some strategic guidance to both technical staff and legal experts should be given in what direction a national ABS system should serve a purpose. Next. What opportunities do you have? Of course, you can look at comprehensive impact assessment opportunities. The EU, for example, has run a 3-year, very comprehensive impact assessment on how different regulations on EU users would impact on their operations, for example. These funds are very often not available to developing countries and to Africa. To some extent, it might still be possible. But however, a lot of questions arise when texts are being drafted. And in that regard, in the process of drafting the national frameworks, the ABS initiative has been approached for some guidance. Okay, how can this framework protocol be implemented meaningfully at national level against the background of the African Union guidelines? Next. So the experts of the initiative, with all the expertise and experiences gained over the years, we wanted to offer some guidance for countries that, on the one hand, do not have an ABS system in place or have not finally developed it. This is in order to put process on developing national systems on track from the start, or whether then, of course, there were some reorientations necessary, processes that have already started halfway, for example. There are a lot of countries that do have a framework laws in place, but no implementing regulations. And there are also some countries that are now rethinking their national frameworks that have that are in amendment. And for those, we wanted to compile a couple of options on how to address and move forward. Next. This brochure, this ABS implementation options brochure, and we will also be happy to share this with you in case you don't have it. It's also available on the website of the ABS initiative. We'll discuss fundamental implementation options, so quite broad decisions to establish a country's overall strategy. So, and also some detailed ones, specific ones, and also some reflections. And I will go into detail on that in the next slide. So if we discuss now on how to address a national ABS system more generally, fundamentally, of course, there are questions that are arising. On the overall approach, do I want to create a system which is quite open and market-oriented, which to possibly cover all opportunities of valorization of genetic resources, or is my primary political goal to protect my genetic resources and to avoid misappropriation by all means? There's a trade-off between both, and that, of course, would need to be considered. Regulatory frameworks, questions. Are we talking about a standalone regulatory framework in one competent national authority? Are we going for cross-sectoral options? This all can be done under the Nagoya Protocol and also, of course, under the AU guidelines. That can be reflected in permitting systems, centralized or decentralized permitting systems, and of course, with respect, whom do you want to provide access at what costs? I mean, varying uniform access requirements. Are you excluding special user groups, national ones, research, and so on? These are all decisions that one would need to make before really starting the drafting of national frameworks, because that provides the national fundamental orientation. Next, there are, of course, a lot of more detailed issues that one needs to address. It's on what is the functional scope, how do I deal with specific provisions, like, for example, the linkage to the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources. What's about facilitated access to research, for example? How do I go about that? What forms of access can be set up? What is the role of permits? Am I going for sectoral permits? Which are the entities that will grant PIC? Are those the local communities? Are these national governments? Is this the competent national authority? What is the role of indigenous peoples and local communities in providing access? And there is no one-size rule at all, and also not in Africa. Same is true for benefit sharing. Who is going to negotiate benefit sharing? What forms? Is it in a national fund? Is it individually? Who will take care of the negotiation? And then finally, of course, questions on monitoring and compliance. What checkpoints? Where checkpoints? What will be their different tasks? And this is just an upcoming issue in a couple of African countries right now. Next. So in this publication, and what we will discuss then further in the next seminars, It's then on characteristics, it's on country examples, and also maybe some experiences. We were trying to look at possible advantages of approaches and also what could be disadvantages and what implications might be foreseen legally and administratively. Next. So, keeping all this in mind, what we are presenting is just a collection of thoughts by the initiative and some experts. We can't be comprehensive. And of course, what is reflected is more or less the ends of a spectrum. And there are sometimes, of course, some mixed forms possible. Next. So if I may just guide you briefly through some examples where we won't have too much time to discuss them, but this is once again just to create some appetite, because these implementation options are going to be presented and further discussed in the next seminar. Next. So if we look at the fundamental implementation options, how do you go about it? Are you going rather for a cross-sectoral ABS framework, which means that you will have separate documents for different sectors, let's say one for protected areas, one for communal lands, one for marine, and so on, with different strategies and guidelines? Or would you rather go for one standalone ABS framework, kind of an umbrella? And we would see, and we do see that both approaches, be it cross-sectoral or standalone, are being implemented as a guiding principle in worldwide and in Africa. They do have advantages. They have, like for example, you could go more in an incremental way. If you do have already different sectoral legislations, you could amend the sectoral legislations with ABS aspects, which is definitely an advantage. But there are, of course, disadvantages. Advantages in the standalone would be, for example, that advantages in coordination, everything is in one hand, and you would then, of course, be easier in probably presenting and the ABS framework. Next is that, of course, I said as much as there are possible advantages, there are also disadvantages. I don't want to get here into detail. We have also tried to list at least some of them. Once again, they are not they're not comprehensive. But what also was taken up as quite important is what are the possible implications for legal and administrative measures? So what do you have to deal with it? I mean, in a cross-sectoral ABS framework, of course, there are.
Oh, thank you very much. Since we are a bit behind the time, and since I do not see additional questions right now popping up in the chat, we can actually regain some time with this slightly shorter Q&A session. And so with that, I would like to ask Eva to show the next slides. Exactly. So we have one more point basically on the agenda, that's diverse and next steps. There have been some questions that could not be answered during the Q&A session, so we will try to provide some elements of response for those in the reporting. So no worries, we will get back to you. You know that there are those other webinars coming up. The next, we just finished, or we are about to finish the first one, introduction, and the next one, how to get started, is mostly addressing countries that are about to start or are going to reorient maybe a process that has already started, or maybe even want to revise. If you have a system already more or less advanced, this might not be the most suitable one for you. You're still very much welcome to join. Maybe there's still some new insights, especially regarding the role of visualizations and how to use them strategically. That might be interesting for you. And then there's the choice of suitable legal instruments, how to choose the instrument that helps you to achieve the goals you have set yourself that you want to reach with your ABS system. And then the technical issues go very much into details, and it is possible that it's not going to be only one webinar on technical issues. If there's going to be intense discussions on single topics, we might extend that according to the needs that we will see. So yes, please choose how and where to attend. The questions that we had for the chat concerning the periodicity or the frequency of the upcoming webinars, I see a close call between every 2 weeks and once a month. We will count it down to the individual after this webinar, and then decide accordingly. But we had announced the next webinars for every week from now on, and based on the feedbacks we got from you, it's very likely that we will not do it on a weekly basis, but maybe on a basis every 2 weeks or once a month. As I said, we will get back to you. On this, the reporting, as I said, will be there will be a audio-visual documentation, so basically a web video available for download from the presentations. The discussions will be cut out due to data protection issues, and we will try to sum up the discussions in an anonymized report that will be then sent to you, and together it should be quite a good package to summarize and document this webinar. And according to the decision, every 2 weeks or once a month, we will also send you the invitations for the webinar. Once again, our excuses for not having been able to respect everything that we wrote in the concept note. We wanted to share the presentations ahead of time and all of this. As we said, it was our first webinar, so things didn't go as smooth as they should. Hopefully that's going to be better for the next time. We will work on that. That's what we can promise. And yes, we'll take it from there. Next slide, please. Ifa, with that, we're through. We're 2 minutes behind the time. I see 2 more comments every 2 weeks, so that might be the tipping point towards the 2 weeks. As I said, we'll analyze that further. Thank you very much for attending. And as you see, even Batman is coughing in COVID-conform manner. So please stay healthy. Make sure that you minimize the risk of infection at your side. We need you all for a continuous and successful implementation of ABS in Africa. With that, I don't know whether Hartmut or Andreas want to say a last word of goodbye.
Well, yes, since I opened, I just also like to say thank you to all and to the contributions. I think this was a good start to our series. And, well, I look forward to hear you again, and of course to see you again in I don't know how many weeks or months. Thanks a lot.
Thank you and goodbye.